Welcome back to the first of our guest lecture series here at CAP. I'm Dave Ferguson, Dean of the College of Architecture and Planning, and we're delighted to have a great launch to this guest lecture series tonight. We had actually a lunch earlier with some leaders in Muncie, and it was a very engaging process that showed that the lessons that are being experienced and proven in Carmel are translatable to other locations around the country. So Mayor Jim Brainard is a 6-term mayor in Carmel. And to give you some context, when he came into office, Carmel was a little burg down the road, not that significant to the city of Indianapolis, have about 25,000 people. They have since quadrupled their size in the last 20-some years under Jim's leadership. If you think about that, most cities think in terms of gaining a few percentage points in growth up or down. Rarely do you hear of a city that has quadrupled its size and done it so successfully. There's an emphasis in the city of Carmel under Jim's leadership that focuses on quality of place as one of the drivers of economic development. And one of the reasons that a number of corporate headquarters, he'll probably give you the number of corporate headquarters, have brought their companies to the city of Carmel, along with creatives and various employees. The development has included an arts and design district, a downtown that was essentially built from scratch because there was no downtown there originally, called City Center, and a new Midtown project that's going to join the two together. He's created a very walkable city, a vibrant city, and I have to put in a plug for some of our alums who work with him in the community development department. Most of the planning department there is, if not all of them. All of them are Ball State grads, CAP grads. Jim speaks around the country and around the world about some of the successes and topics that range from city planning to climate change to redevelopment to roadway networks. It's significant that this is the beginning of National Roundabout Week because Carmel has more roundabouts than any other city in the country, and he'll probably talk about that. Some of the other issues that are in his repertoire include how art and culture can be used to foster economic development, how placemaking is integral to revitalizing and expanding a town center, and how prioritizing civic design creates a more livable city. Carmel has been among Money Magazine's best places to live in America for a number of years. They were #1 in 2012. And they've been recognized as a Community of the Year by the Indiana Chamber of Commerce. They received first place in the Climate Protection Awards from the U.S. Conference of Mayors and numerous other awards that have been attributed to their rapid rise and success. So, and I should also add, because he'll probably say it if I don't, we went to grade school together. So we've known each other for quite a while, and it's been an interesting process of watching his effect and impact on the city of Carmel. So without further ado, Jim Brainard.
Thank you, David. We're very nice to each other, so we each know a lot about each other. You know, when you go to grade school with somebody, you know a lot about them. It's great to be here. Just out of curiosity, how many of you are juniors or seniors? By a show of hands. How many are freshmen or sophomores? Okay, that's what I wanted to know. We've got some of what I'm going to show you today, especially in the PowerPoint, is what I use when I go to other places to talk about Carmel, to try to talk to people who might move a business to Carmel and then hire people in Carmel. So one of the first things I do is point out where we are. Of course, you know, anybody here not from Indiana originally? Raise your hands. Oh, okay, a few of you. And we're what, for many years, is called a suburb. We're on the edge of a major traditional city. And suburbs didn't really get started, for the most part, until after World War II. We didn't have over 25% car ownership until after World War II. Think about your history class for a minute. We had the World War I, but U.S. involvement was between 1914 and 1918. Then there was kind of a little recession after the war, but then the 1920s started. There's all this economic activity. People were building houses very quickly, cities were growing, but there were still traditional block grids, basically with alleys on streetcar lines in the major cities or close to the downtown area in the smaller cities and towns around the Midwest. Then the Great Depression. Anybody know what year that started? Did I hear 1929? Yes, that's right, 1929. So all the new construction stopped. Not much got built for about a decade. And it was just getting started again, 1939 or so. What happened in December of 1941? Anybody know that? World War II. Japan on December 7th bombed Pearl Harbor and led to our entrance into World War II, which had been going for several years in Europe and Asia. And so everything was rationed. I heard these stories from my grandparents and my parents when I was a kid. You couldn't go out and just buy gasoline for your car. You couldn't use steel, you couldn't use rubber, all these things you had to get a government coupon for because everything was going to there were ration cards. And so unless you had a war-related reason to drive, you couldn't go buy gasoline. So our cities were still basically walkable, powered by public transit in the larger cities, and we hadn't really spread out to the suburbs yet. Then after the war, what happens? 1946, soldiers come home. Usually there's a recession after a war because you don't making all this war equipment anymore, but we really didn't have much of one because Europe was in shambles, Asia was in shambles, all these cities needed to be rebuilt on either side of the Pacific and the Atlantic, and our industrial might was virtually untouched. It hadn't been bombed. And so all these people needed all sorts of products. And so our economy really picked up. And for the first time in human history, you had the average working person making a decent living. Probably really is the first time. And cars started rolling off the assembly plants. They converted all the tank manufacturing, airplane manufacturing back to automobiles. But we had never gotten over 25% automobile ownership because of the Depression and then the war. People had to put the cars they owned up on blocks, and ownership of cars actually fell. So suddenly, after the war, though, we decided to start designing our cities for cars, not for people. What was the condition of our cities in 1945? How were they heated? Anybody know that? Anybody grew up in an older house? You had an old bin on the side by the driveway. You dumped coal in. That's what used to happen. You can still see these soldered up in a lot of older houses built before 1950. Older areas of any city in Indiana, they dump coal into the basement. You go down at night before you went to bed and shovel coal into the furnace. I remember coming to Indianapolis when I was about 6 or 7. My dad was a school band director up in the northern part of the state near Elkhart. That's where I met David. And used to bring students to music contests at Butler every year. And I remember I was 6 or 7. I remember asking my mother, why is the sink full of black stuff after I washed my face? What happened at night? And it was all the coal dust in the big city of Indianapolis. Because in 1960, natural gas really wasn't being used to heat buildings yet. A lot of buildings didn't even have air conditioning yet. It was just getting started. So it was still powered by coal. Anybody know when antibiotics were invented? Penicillin? It happened right before the war, before World War II. So they didn't know how to mass produce them yet, so they were using these antibiotics for the soldiers that were injured, but they really weren't out in the general public. And remember, between the Depression and the war, what wasn't happening? There wasn't any new apartment buildings being built, no new houses being built, so there's this housing shortage. I have numerable friends that, their parents immigrated from Eastern Europe or somewhere to New York City in the 30s. They ended up having 2 or 3 generations in a small apartment, 1 or 2 bedrooms, maybe 8 or 9 people in New York City, Boston. There was a lot of that going on in the country because there was no construction. People were crowded. So cities were powered by coal. They were dirty. Disease spread quickly because there weren't antibiotics yet. and a lot of people hadn't been able to buy houses because of the Depression. The rental rates had gone way up. Home ownership wasn't what it has been since the end of World War II. So cities weren't really pleasant places back then. Anybody ever watched Jimmy Stewart in the movie It's a Wonderful Life, that Christmas movie? Most of you seen that? It's a good movie. But think about the themes in that movie. The big bad landlord over here, Potter, and here's the good guy, you know, helping build this subdivision out on the edge of town where, of course, that was still close enough at what they weren't thinking about cars. The immigrant family, you know, he had an Italian family, and one of the scenes, you know, he was giving bread and wine to them to welcome them into their new home, what the savings and loan industry was doing. But it had those themes that it started with Thomas Jefferson about the United States being a country of small artisans and craftsmen. Big cities of Europe were bad. Well, big cities used to be bad in some ways because they were dirty. They were prone to disease and epidemics. People were overcrowded. It's all changed now. You know, natural gas and electric heat's pretty clean. But yet we have built a society in this country where the average person spends not 1 hour, but 2 hours a day in their automobile. That's an average. So you know about averages. If the average is 2 hours a day, somebody else in New York or Boston doesn't own a car. My daughter's going to grad school in Boston, doesn't own a car. She walks everywhere. If that's an average, then there must be people driving 3 and 4 hours a day, and lots of them. And that is the case in Indiana. You talk to people all the time. Not maybe so much around Indianapolis, central Indiana area. Sometimes. I know people that live in Indianapolis that teach here, so it's an hour at least each way. Talk to people in California and other big cities, Atlanta, Texas. Easily 2 and 2.5 hour commute to get to a place where it's a little cheaper to live isn't unusual. Maybe 10 miles on the interstate to a grocery store. So we have built our cities. We haven't been real thoughtful about how to do it. Think of the waste, just the general economic waste of having to build all those highways, to take all those cars, the traffic congestion it takes. If somebody has to drive 10 miles to the grocery store as opposed to 1 mile, that means that road's 10 times bigger forever, has to be it's 10 times more congested. Think about that. So what happened in the early 1990s? I remember the day that I did it, first time in 1991, November 9th. Remember that because one of my children was born later that afternoon. I remember the date. But I know what I'm talking about. You guys probably were not born yet, most of you. That was the day I popped in my first disk to connect to the internet. One of my clients called me. I was a lawyer. So every day I made the trek from Carmel to downtown Indianapolis, about a 40-minute drive, then back, hour and a half out of my day every day. But I had to be there because I needed to be, did a lot of real estate work, so I had to be close to the title, the other attorneys. I had to be close to the accountants, to be close to the developers that bought and sold projects, the builders, the title insurance people, the regular insurance people, all these professionals that I had to work with. You know why? Because we had to deliver documents back and forth to them. You know how you did that back then? You took them in at lunch hour and dropped them off at the office a couple blocks away, or you had an assistant that did it for you, or if you were a big fancy firm, you might hire a courier company or have a couple kids that are couriers to run documents around. And they were typed on typewriters for the most part, and you would then take a red pencil or a blue pencil and cross out, you're negotiating a legal contract. The other side didn't like that phrase. They want to reword it. They'd send it back to me. I'd cross it out, use a different colored pencil. About every 3 or 4 versions, somebody'd have to retype it with what was agreed upon. You keep going until you got a negotiated contract. We used carbon paper to make copies. Of course, we had photocopy machines as well. We still use carbon paper to save money. And then the internet came along. November 9th, 1991, I popped in my disk because a client called me and said, and he had already moved out closer to his house in the suburbs on the edge of Indianapolis. And he said, you know, if you use this new system, this internet thing, I can just send you the contracts over the internet. I wasn't quite sure what the internet was, but I kind of knew about it. So I went to the drugstore and bought this disc for $1. Popped it in. It was the old connection where you'd have different tones. Anybody ever, you guys know what I'm talking about? Okay. And it was slow. It downloaded. Took 4 or 5 minutes to download. And I had this basic AOL 1.0, America Online 1.0. I still have the same email address. Why change it, right? And it doesn't have a number associated with it, just my initials, name and initials, as it was so early. There weren't many people using it yet. But I was suddenly able to move documents around using the internet. So after a month or so, I thought, why is my office downtown? Why am I driving? And this was catching on pretty quickly at that point. Why don't I move it closer to my house and get an hour and a half of my day back, save all that gas money? And so these people were coming to the same conclusion all over the United States. And so that was a chance for our suburbs, which had started out just as places to sleep and good places to educate your kids in the public schools that might be a little bit better than in the traditional cities. Suddenly thought, wait a minute, we now have the option to make these cities, to make these suburbs into full-fledged cities, very traditional cities. So I ran for mayor in 1995, 4 years later, and I knocked on about 6,000 or 7,000 doors. And people kept saying, I wish I could go out for a dinner and a show and not have to drive somewhere. I wish I could walk places I actually needed to go. And I heard this in different ways. Different people said it differently, of course, but I heard the same theme from thousands of people. So I was a history major and a lawyer. I didn't know anything about engineering or city planning. I had been always interested in architecture as an avocation. I liked architecture. I liked looking at architecture. Back in, in the 8th grade, when you list the 3 professions you might be interested in, architecture is one of them, but I never pursued it. I think it had something to do with my math grades. I figured I'd have to use math in a slide rule back then. So I went into history. So I started looking at this from a historical perspective, and I thought, wait a minute. What people are saying to me is they want a very traditional city, a place where they can go out, walk places they actually need to go, look at the architecture. I have this theory that architecture got very uninteresting about the time that we all got in cars and started driving around and quit walking around looking at it. So here's a little comment on society. It has to be somewhere in the South or the West because of the palm tree in the picture. But think about this. Can you hear me in the back and way up there in the cheap seats? Do you pay less for those? You get a discount on tuition for being up there? I'll try to look up now and then and not forget you. These guys are obviously paying to go to this fitness center. You know, a monthly fee. It's what people do when they're adults. The university doesn't provide it. They have to pay, 10, 20, 30 bucks a month to go work out. But instead of taking the stairs to get to their treadmill and their elliptical, their Stairmaster, they are taking the escalator to get up there to exercise. But this is the mindset that we have in the United States. You can't walk anywhere. Everybody looks for the closest parking space closest to the building, but then they go to the gym for an hour. Why not park in the back of the parking lot and walk into the store? Because we haven't built the walk into daily life. Anybody ever go for a romantic walk? There's one guy here. Okay, good, good. As you get older, you'll think about doing it. This is where you don't want to take your date for a romantic walk. Everybody think of going on a romantic walk past the big box parking lot, past the Walmart parking lot, or the Meijer parking lot, or the Target parking lot. Shouldn't pick on Walmart. They're all the same. And then how's that for city planning? Look how much wasted space that is between those buildings. Anybody know how much a 2-lane road that goes for 1 mile cost in dollars today in the Midwest, in Indiana? A lot. That's the correct answer. Anybody want to take a guess? How much? No, not even close. Now this would be a nice road. Storm sewer, curbs, bike path, street lights. Try $12 million a mile. That's a 2-lane road. Of course, it varies a little bit depending on what the land costs for that new road. You know, some places are more expensive than others, but the other costs are pretty constant. $12 million a mile. So you have all this infrastructure. The farther you sprawl out, think what that does to the taxpayer. That takes money away from schools and social safety nets and all the things that people need to do. Never, architects and land planners in the room never designed that. Look at the amount of parking. And let's say I wanted to walk there. Do you think that really would be possible? Let's say I'm going to jump over the interstate. So we've built these things so you can't walk anywhere you need to go. All those stores in that traditional mall are surrounded by these gargantuan traffic lights. This is one of my favorites. Take a look at that one. Now, do you really want to be that pedestrian? How are they going to get across the other side with that traffic? And think about being in that traffic, in a car. Is that really adding your quality of life? Does that feel uplifting when you're sitting there? And then there's this. Now, let's hope nobody from Purdue did this. This is what they do at Purdue, the traffic engineers. Do we have anybody that's a civil engineer here? Ball State doesn't teach that, so probably not. So I can offend civil engineers at will, right, without hearing about it? It'll get back. It'll get back to them. This is going to last for 30 years. It's going to have to be rebuilt. Think how much concrete is in that. One of the things we did when we quit doing traditional neighborhood development, remember we used to have alleys to put the trash back and the mail would be delivered back there in the older homes. And then you'd have the porches up close to the street so people would actually sit in their porch before air conditioning and talk to their neighbors. And so you could walk somewhere. You had narrow lots because you had really wide lots like we do in our subdivisions. It'd be too far to walk somewhere you needed to go. So you have narrow lots that go back. And then you have common parks that everybody uses. Instead of going in the backyard and having your kids on the swing set back there all by themselves, you grab your Coca-Cola or whatever, your Pepsi, and go across and out in a little square within 3 or 4 minutes of everyone's house, and you actually meet your neighbors and know people. And what does that do to add to the sense of community? A lot. That's another great, brilliant traffic configuration done by a civil engineer from somewhere. Look at this. How sustainable is that? No stores, can't walk anywhere. That's all houses. And then this is one of my all-time favorites. Let's talk about climate for a minute and density. You think more people put out more cars? Are you concerned about density and climate change? How many of you are concerned about it? Raise your hands. Pretty much everybody, okay. There's a lot of fiscal reasons to be concerned about it, even if you're not concerned about it from how's the earth going to be in 30, 40, 50, 100 years. But this is the city of Chicago. Oh, the next slide, here we go. City of Chicago. You see the lake there off to the right. And the slide on the left, you see all that orange stuff? That's the most carbon coming out of that area. You see it's in the densest area where you have walkability and up the Gold Coast and Wrigleyville and that area. And you see blue, which is a lot less carbon output out on the edge, on the one on the left. Then you look at it a bit differently at the right. And that's a per capita analysis. Everybody know what per capita means? Per person. Means per head, translated directly from the Latin. Per head, per person. And you see the per person output of carbon and energy is far, far less in the denser areas because people are walking places. The larger buildings are a bit more efficient. You don't have the sprawl. It's the urban sprawl that is causing a lot of the problem. So how do you handle a big box and get rid of that big parking lot and make it someplace people want to walk to? Well, here's what we did for the Dick's sporting goods store in Carmel. Put the cars in back. It's a pretty simple solution. You still have the big parking lot, but at least it makes it more comfortable for people to walk through that green space and the fountain and the park to get there. So Carmel, as Dean Ferguson said, had about 25,000 people in 19 '96 when I became mayor. Today it's over 100,000. We had a little 10 by 4 block downtown area. It was a traditional town that had been started back in the 1830s, like a lot of small towns throughout Indiana and the Midwest. And we knew we had 50 square miles. That happens to be double the land mass of the island of Manhattan in New York City, double. They're about 26 square miles, we're about 50. So we knew that little downtown would not work for us long term. We wanted to keep it, we wanted to put money into it, we wanted to see it thrive. Nobody really went there. There was an old beat up bar. There was an old Chinese restaurant that wasn't, many people didn't go there, and that was about it. A bunch of abandoned warehouse buildings. For those of you from Carmel, ask your parents about what it was like in 1995. So we put up the archways, we turned it in the Art and Design District. So how do we incentivize people to go there? So we want multi-story buildings, up 3 to 5 stories. And people didn't do that in the suburbs. We had to work with the bankers and the developers to convince them to do it and incentivize it in the beginning. We added street trees, that's so important. We added public sculpture. We put up the archways to define the place so people from out of town actually knew when they got there. We have had hundreds of millions of dollars invested in that area over the last 20 years, and you could go there tonight, nice evening, still good weather, and there would be people everywhere on the street. We bumped out, got rid of parking spaces on the street, and actually created little outdoor dining areas on the street, made the sidewalk bigger, reduced the size of the vehicular street. That also controls speed. It automatically, instead of having to put police officers out there to write tickets for speed, just because the streets narrower, people drive slower. It's safer for pedestrians. That's our art festival going on. We created that logo you see, the multicolored one right below the, see, I have a pointer here. Oops, I'm on the wrong slide. Sorry, there we go. Right there, that logo, we created that, put that on all the street posts so that, street lights so that people know. All those buildings you see were what you call public-private partnerships. We put a lot of the parking underground. We paid for that with the new tax revenues. Anybody know what it costs to build a parking space underground? Take a guess.
30.
What?
34,000.
I was going to say 35. Maybe you're exactly on. That's 30 to 35,000. That's exactly right. So that's expensive. It costs maybe 8 to 10,000 to build a surface parking lot per space. So it's a lot more, 3.5 times more expensive to put it underground, at least, maybe 4 times, depending where in the bid. So we thought it was important, though, to get the cars out of the way. You still have to accommodate them. You make it pedestrian friendly, but let's face it, people still drive most places in most of our cities in the Midwest. So what we did, we took the taxes, it's called tax incremental financing, taxes from the new development, used it to pay for a loan for the underground parking. But if you go up 5 stories, anybody know how property taxes are collected? It's per square foot. So much per square foot, maybe a couple dollars a year per square foot. So if we have one redevelopment site right now, it's 9 acres, going to connect 2 of our redevelopment districts. It's an old, 95% of it's an old parking lot, few one-story buildings in the 1950s. Anybody from Carmel here? Mohawk Square, Monon Square, does that ring a bell where Soho Cafe is, guys? That's the one we're talking about. Our redevelopment commission bought it in December for $15 million. We're going to redevelop it. It's a lot of money for 9 acres. We're going to redevelop it. It's going to connect 2 of our redevelopment districts. We're getting, and this is the key, $60,000 a year in property taxes for it today. When it's redeveloped, the way Western Europe was built for hundreds of years before cars at 5 levels with underground parking or parking in structures, we'll get $3 million a year. 60,000 to 3 million. That's a huge increase. Any business person would say, how are you doing that? How we're doing that is going up a little bit. And then we take maybe 2.5 million of that, 2.4, let's say 2,400,000, use it to pay off a loan for that underground parking. So now we're getting 3 million minus 2,400,000 is 600,000. That's 10 times what 60,000 is. So we're getting 10 times additional revenue We have enough money over to put beautiful brick streets in, to put fountains in, to add public art, to give the developers incentives as long as they use it on architectural detail that makes the area, or better architecture, better building materials, which adds lasting value to the community. So that's what a public-private partnership is. One of the things when I was first elected, I asked the question, why aren't we building our cities so they're walkable? And there was a lot of resistance to doing it. People said people don't want that. I said, no, I was just out in the campaign trail and talked to about 6,000 people that tell me they do want that. I heard it over and over again. Why isn't it happening? And so we identified all the legal and financial impediments to doing it. And the only way, land is so inexpensive in the Midwest, the only way to really, and most places in the country, the South as well, the only way to do that is to partner between government and the developer to get, it's just cheaper to put the parking out on the surface lot. But then who pays for that road that has to go 10 times farther longer at 10 to 12 million bucks a mile? Who has to pay for all that sprawl? Well, we do as taxpayers. So if we take the new taxes, use it to get the cars underground and the structures, then we save money in the long run. We get a lot more revenue. We don't have to sprawl out. So if you go up 5 stories and put the parking underground, your density is going up 40, 50 times. That means that larger road can be 1/40th or 1/50th of the length it would have had to be to get the same amount of economic development in your city. So one of the things that you as architects and land planners and people that want to help plan cities in the future, and there's been very little attention given to this, I think, is to, one of the best arguments to doing it right and creating walkable, pedestrian-friendly communities is to do a fiscal analysis, A or B. And then when the volunteer plan commissioners and the volunteer city council members that have to make these zoning decisions see the difference over a 10, 15, 25, 30-year period, it's such a huge amount that they'll start to pay attention. Here's one of our before and after pictures. That was an old warehouse building. I thought we ought to take a before picture actually after the raising had started, but then we built this, worked with a developer. That was the first project in the Carmel Arts and Design District, built about 1998. 2 outdoor restaurants, 2 levels of housing above ground floor retail. We just put the cars in the back. We got rid of 1 street. And you don't really want to get rid of your grid system. We left it a pedestrian street in the middle that goes to the back parking. And we used masonry materials in the front. Actually picked up the brick patterns from our historic Carnegie Library on Main Street. Used the same patterns. There's some people on the Monon Trail, which is a rail-to-trail project, an old railroad in Carmel that had started in the little town of Monon up by Chicago. It was actually installed during the Civil War to take food to the Union troops fighting in the South during the Civil War. Most of our rail lines run east-west. This one goes north-south. And so we turned it back into a walking and biking trail. We had to actually condemn and buy 246 pieces of property. For the lawyers in the room, they were classified as what's called a reversionary deed. When the deed, go to law school, you'll learn there's different types of deeds. A reversionary deed is a type that reverts back when the use for which it was given for a specified use, in this case a railroad, and when they quit running trains on those tracks, the court said it had reverted back to the original parcel from which it was taken back in the 1860s. So we had to go to the current owners of all those parcels, 246 of them, and make them an offer. Of course, the train company and the adjoining parcel owners were in a lawsuit trying to figure out who actually owned it, because the train companies are arguing they weren't reversionary deeds and they should get our money. So it was a very complicated property acquisition process, but those railroad trail projects are very important and helpful. This is our beachfront property in Carmel. Now, if you look at that building on your left, that was one of our more recent public-private partnerships. See, I think it's in the second French Empire style. Did I get that right, architects in the room? That was the inspiration for it, at least. It has a center courtyard in it, which is a public plaza with a beautiful fountain and plantings. And below that building is where it gets interesting. 2 levels of underground parking, paid for by the taxes from that building, so it didn't take anything off the existing tax base. Anybody familiar with Topgolf and the IKEA store in Fishers? How many of you have seen that? It's on 50 acres. This is on 2 acres. Pays the same amount of property tax. So think about that from a utilization standpoint and a governmental standpoint and trying to pay for all the things we don't have enough money to pay for. There's a picture of it. And there's a picture of the plaza in the middle. Isn't that beautiful? European-style courtyard. It's about making places where people can come together. And if you're going to have density like this, and people say, oh, it's high-density stuff. We don't want that. So I pull up a picture of Singapore on my phone and say, no, this is high density. Then I pull up a picture of Midtown New York. So this is medium density, you know, south of, you know, in between downtown and uptown New York. Because of the structure of the island, they can't go up more than about 10 stories. I say this is medium density. And this is low urban density. We're not going to go above 5 stories. There's some interesting work out. It's a book called Urban Sprawl and Public Health written by one of the 3 authors, a friend of mine named Dick Jackson. Used to teach at UCLA in California. And he has a lot of data that show how bad sprawl is for health of people. Obesity rates are 1/3 higher where people can't walk anywhere they need to go. Even overweight rates are 1/3 higher. He's found the same data supports bad health if you go above 5 stories too. I had this illustrated to me the other day. It's lack of connection with the street life, I think. That's what he thinks as well, if you read his book. I was walking in our city center, and a friend of mine was up on his balcony about 3 levels up. And he saw me, he wanted to talk to me about something, city issue. So he comes out on his balcony, it's in the evening, and he says, hey Jim, what about this? We started having a conversation between his 3rd floor apartment and the city street I was on. It's a very traditional setting, and I thought, this is what Dick Jackson's talking about in the book. You're connected to life on the street if you don't go above about 5 levels. And that was the way Western Europe was built forever. How many of you have gotten to go to Europe at one point in your lives? If you get the opportunity to do some overseas study, take advantage of it and do it. Or work an extra job. Do that, it's worth it. When you get there, you count all these old buildings. You know, for those of you who've been able to do it, you'll get off that long 8-9 hour plane ride, you'll be tired, and you'll probably go out and get a cup of coffee as it'll be morning. You leave here in the evening, or 6 hours ahead, so you get there in the morning. And you look around at these beautiful buildings, sitting in a beautiful cafe, kind of people watching. And it kind of begs the question, why can't we build our cities like this? And so that's what we're trying to do in Carmel, is to pick the best ideas from the past, mix them with our new technology, and build beautiful places. There's a before and after. Little building. Used to sell used furniture. They used to throw it out in the yard, and the mice came with it, I think. We replaced it with the building you see in the lower left, which was, you know, inspired by previous buildings, but there's some architectural detail in it. But it's up on the street. It's 4 and 3 stories. It created street life. Look at the people on the street in that picture, and that was just a random day that we took that picture. But we find people are more comfortable with a row of cars down the street and the building up to them. I think it goes back to our prehistoric past when people were out there trying to you know, just prehistoric times when you had to protect yourself at all times. You had a building on one side and these row of cars on the other. It's built into our DNA, but you feel more comfortable. You don't feel open and exposed like you would on the edge of that Walmart parking lot walking along the little tiny sidewalk. And this has been proven by a lot of data and people that have studied that sort of thing as well, massing of buildings. We initiated a bike share. We even put the trikes in that you see in the lower picture for elderly people and maybe kids with, or people with on the autism spectrum that can't balance, so they can get out and ride as well. There's some attention we gave to a little space between 2 buildings that led to a small parking lot. Instead of just an uninteresting passageway, we created a place where people can actually sit, check their messages, read a book. There's a small fountain just out of the camera view of that as well. You have to look at, to all, especially at higher densities, pay attention to these small details when you're building a brand new city or renovating a city. There's what we did out in front of some of our restaurants to keep the people up on the buildings so they're not separated from the storefront and can still look in the windows. We moved the tables out closer to the street, put up that small fence. By encroaching into the vehicular part of the street, it really slowed down speeds. That's Main Street in Carmel. That's one of our public-private partnerships. Both of those are right there. And you see people use those areas. And they like dining al fresco or outdoors. We also we spend 1% of our revenues on public sculpture and the arts, 1 penny out of every dollar. And so that's a series of J. Seward Johnson's realistic sculptures. There was a fun place to start with sculpture. Some of the art students will say, oh, that's not real art. They're bronzes that are painted, but people have fun with them and they interact with them. It was a good place to start a public art program. We have 17 of them, the largest outdoor exhibit of this man's work, who works out of his atelier in New Jersey. If you're ever out there in Princeton, New Jersey, go see his, it's called Grounds for Sculpture. He has 35 acres. It's the former New Jersey State Fairgrounds. And it's filled as a sculpture park. It's an absolutely beautiful place. He's even taken a lot of the French Impressionist pictures and recreated the whole scene out of bronze, like the rowing party with the pond and everything. And they're fun. But these are fun because the Colts are going to play. They show up with t-shirts and sweatshirts depending on the weather. The weather person says it's going to snow. Suddenly they have stocking caps on. So that tells me the community is having fun. You stand there and watch. You see about 10 photos taken every 5 minutes of every one of these sculptures. So people do interact with them and have fun. This is in our art and design district. Some of these are newer houses, some are older ones, but notice how these are built differently than you'd see in a sprawling subdivision. Narrow lots, about 40, 45 feet wide, so you can actually walk places. You know, the lots, as I said earlier, are very wide. You're so far from a store, you can't get somewhere you need to go. And they're brought up to the street. So that if you're sitting on that front porch, you can actually talk to somebody walking down the street. This is the way our cities and towns were built for years, especially before air conditioning. That front porch was the center of social life in the evening in every town in the Midwest and the South of the United States. People would come out on their porches to get cool, and that's where they got to know their neighbors. They got to know the person from a different part of the world. It was just so important as we talk about immigration and how, you know, we form a country that, you know, we're kind of held together by a set of values. We have all this immigration. We don't want this group or we don't want this group going on today. Part of it is because we've designed our cities so they're not built-in opportunities for people from different backgrounds, different religions, different countries, different races to actually get to know each other. And so we have to design our cities with places for people to get to know their neighbors. There's City Hall in Carmel. We sponsored lots of events to, again, same thing, to get people to know each other. We had a retention pond that was just meant to hold water behind City Hall. We have a sister city in Japan, so they donated us that sukamang, which means welcome gate in Japanese, gave us the cherry trees, and we created a beautiful space out of it. Now, I've talked about our art and design district, which was our Old Town area. But then we came about 4 or 5 blocks south, as Dave Ferguson mentioned, and bought 80 acres to build a new downtown. And it was this old Kroger store that they'd moved across the street and abandoned it and left us that. It was in foreclosure. We bought it along with another 70-some acres, total of 88. And that's what we built in the bottom picture, one corner of it, anchored by a new concert hall and 2 small theaters. That's actually built on a parking platform. There's cars underneath those buildings. Here are some of the streets in that area. We paid a lot of attention to materials, to massing, make the streets small. Notice in that bottom picture how the sidewalks are wider than the pedestrian areas. Out at the crosswalk, they're bumped out. There you see our concert hall, which is, of course, inspired by the Villa Rotunda and Vicenza outside of Venice, or if you want to go back a little farther, Pantheon in Rome. You see in the top right picture our Veterans Plaza. It was done by an Indiana artist. Those two soldiers, a woman and a man, were in the reserves. They actually were the models in front of our reflecting. We wanted to put a monument to our veterans, not to our war, but to our veterans, all veterans, in a prominent place. This is the new hotel in our city center that's under construction right now. We call it the Carmichael. Michael Feinstein's club will be in the lower level, a supper club. Kind of like, have you ever watched the old reruns of I Love Lucy? I'm old enough, I saw them originally, they weren't reruns. The old guys in the audience get that. But it's that type of supper club. You go and see a show and have dinner. There's the concert hall, the inside of it. I believe that public architecture ought to inspire people and uplift their spirits. Create places, again, where the community can come together. So that's the Villa Rotonda in Vicenza, Italy, at the top left. And then that's our hall on the bottom, in the interior and the top right. And there's the view of our farmers market and the reflecting pool behind it, right in the middle of our new downtown. This is our master plan downtown. You see the concert hall on the very far right of that photograph. Then you'll see that's our Christkindlmarkt, our German Christmas market. We include a Hanukkah booth. We try to include everybody. But that's ice skating with this market that goes for 6 weeks in December. We're trying to get people out in the community. Ice festivals and things that go on all year, just not in the warm weather months. We don't have that bad of weather here, just bad. I say there's no bad weather, just bad clothing. So we're trying to create a series of events in the winter as well. If you haven't been to this market yet, make a road trip down there over Thanksgiving or before the holidays after finals. There's more pictures from it. The Monon Trail will get up to 15,000 people a day. People commute to work on it. These trails are so important, connecting different parts of your city, connecting every one of our city parks. We went from 40 to about 1,000 acres. It's connected by a trail. Here we created little areas off the trail. We create little small spaces where people can relax when they're on the trail. This is a free reading library. We put in an old English phone booth that we got. We're building a new street called Monon Boulevard. That's actually about half of it's finished today. We used a design firm from Denmark that also we partnered with a local firm made up mainly of Ball State graduates. And so we got some ideas from Europe. Notice the red street's vehicular street. It's 9 feet across, which we talked to civil engineering students, fairly narrow. Some parallel parking along it. The bike path and the pedestrian paths double that. So we focus on pedestrians. You can't drive more than about 10 to 11 miles safely on that street, so we don't really have to patrol it for speed because people can't drive fast on it. Makes it safer for pedestrians. Then we have this plaza. Oops, went the wrong way there. Plaza at the far right. That's filled with people every night. It has ping pong tables that are weatherized, pool tables, a stage, a big screen you can't see in this shot that shows sporting events and movies. And it's bright enough you can even watch it in the daytime. You see that Sun King Brewery there has an outdoor deck. You have another, if you look at the Fork and Ale restaurant here, it has outdoor dining. You've got that deck up there at Sun King and lower deck that's protected from the weather. All these people can take their food out here. They get carry-out food, ping pong tables, pool table, and this is a stage. Some adult swings over here. People can sit in big lawn swings. You got the being a twirly chair. You know what I'm talking about? We got some twirly chairs there too. Those are fun. That's the street. We're putting a lot of public sculpture, splash pads, making it fun, but the buildings are facing this new street. The back street for the cars is the back of the buildings. We're trying to reverse it. Again, designed for people, not for cars. There's more pictures. There's the splash pad. There's the twirly chairs. There's the example I used for Topgolf. Look at the numbers there. IKEA 35 acres, Topgolf 15 acres, for a total of 50. Assessed value 50 million. AV per acre 1 million. AV stands for assessed value. Then Carmel, Sophia Square, that second French Empire building I showed you, 2.1 acres. We got 47 million. So the assessed value per acre is 23.5. And so the infrastructure needed for that is 1/25th what they needed for theirs to get the same amount of revenue. And I don't think anybody's going for a romantic walk past the IKEA parking lot. Okay, there's Keystone Avenue in Carmel. The top picture is looking at Indianapolis with a sign sprawl, I call it. And then there's the picture, we don't allow off-premise signs in Carmel. And there's the fact that it's a cloudy day in one picture and blue sky is just incidental. But the point is that doesn't it look nicer with the trees instead of the stupid signs? And you know, Wendy's wants a sign that's 50 feet tall, and McDonald's wants one that's 60 feet tall, and then Burger King wants one that's 70 feet tall, then Kentucky Fried wants 90 feet, and then McDonald's starts over and wants 95 feet, and it's just never ending. I want to be higher than my competitors. Just say no to all of it. And we're have one of the fastest growing business sectors in the state. We have 125 corporate headquarters in the state. Some of it's driven by our good school system, but a lot of it's driven by our placemaking. People want to be in a place, and this is how we do economic development in Carmel, Indiana. We know we have no mountains and we have no oceans. I say we're just like Paris, lousy weather, no mountains and no oceans, and they did just fine. But the day that we can't, so we have to focus on a built environment. We have to focus on building beautiful places because we don't have those natural amenities. Moving into fall, you know, it is beautiful here. So we do have times of the year when it's beautiful, and sometimes in the winter, the starkness, the snow can be beautiful too. But to the extent that we can't attract the best and brightest people from the best universities and colleges all over the world, including Ball State, but if the guy that went to school in Paris, the person that went to college in California isn't willing to come to Indiana and raise their family and build their lives here, those big companies that provide all those good paying jobs are going to go elsewhere. So it's vital that we build a place where people, the best and brightest people from all over the country are willing to come. So we had a 5-lane road called Range Line Road running down the middle of the city. Anybody from Carmel hear about complaints when we turned it into a 2-lane road called a road diet? Put a bike lane in, widen the sidewalks, put trees in the middle, slowed down traffic, vehicular traffic, so pedestrians were safer. We added roundabouts instead of the stop signs, and since we moved 50% more cars per hour in a roundabout than you do a stoplight, I said stop sign, I meant stoplight, a signalized intersection, we didn't reduce trip times. We just slowed down speeds, and it made it a lot safer. We put medians in the middle and we use roundabouts. We can eliminate left-hand turns, which are very dangerous traffic maneuvers. You just go to the next roundabout and do a U-turn. That becomes much safer. I'll talk about roundabout safety in a minute, then open it up for some questions. There's one of our streets. We did a tree inventory of this new street. You see the bike path up above the curb, so it's safer. If you have room to do that, that's ideal. We left those old growth trees in the middle because we had the civil engineers. I insisted they do a tree inventory, and then we adjusted the road to avoid the trees. Novel concept instead of cutting them down, right? But the flowers in the middle, that's obviously in the spring when the daffodils are out, but made that beautiful, then brought up those townhomes right to the street. So I can't give a speech without talking about roundabouts since we have more than anybody else in the country. Anybody know why we do it? Number one reason. Somebody from Carmel must know this. We've been talking about it for 20 years. Safety. We reduce our injury accidents by 80%. Anybody in this room ever speed up to go through a stoplight or a yellow light or a green light? No one's admitting to it. Okay, I will. I do it. Everybody does it, right? Even you see that green light. I caught myself here in Muncie coming here today. I was running just on time, not quite late, but just on time. And here's a light. I thought that light's been green for a while. It's going to change. I accelerated. I thought, see, I'm doing it. That's what everybody does. And so we know what the human error rate is about 1 to 4 out of a million in an intersection are going to crash. So is it going to be a high-speed crash as I just gunned it to get through that green light? Or is it going to be a low-speed crash because everyone has to slow down at the roundabout? A pedestrian, for instance, has a 90% chance 95% chance actually of dying if they're hit by a car at 50 miles an hour. At 10 miles an hour, they have about a 98% chance of surviving. That's a huge difference. So speed is the culprit. The U.S. average fatality rate per 100,000 people on a street or highway or road is 14 per 100,000. 14. I read an article that said New York City is the best. They were at 3.5 per 100,000. We know why that is, because it's so congested nobody can drive fast. They were wrong. Carmel's at 1.8, under 2%, trailing average over the last 5 years. So we haven't found anybody in the country yet that's safer. These are talking about pedestrian and traffic fatalities. 2 per 100,000. We'd like to eliminate those two. Those tend to be drunks and motorcyclists. Don't ride a motorcycle, people. But 2 per 100,000. I checked this county before I came up here, 12 or 13, which isn't the worst in Indiana. There's places that are 25 to 30 per 100,000 per year in Indiana. But it's stoplights. Stoplights create a false sense of safety. Even you have accidents. You think 1 to 4 out of a million isn't that many, but if you have 100,000 people, do the math, through a signalized intersection a day, that's 1 to 4 accidents every 10 days. If you have 50,000, that's 1 to 4 every 20 days. You can just do the math, 25,000 every 40 days. But still, 1 to 4 accidents. So it does make a difference. Anybody know about the environmental benefits of roundabouts? Anybody here a physics major in high school, or take physics class in high school? Okay, talk to me about the law of momentum. What's it say?
Well, it's a mass times velocity, so that when you increase your mass, you have more momentum, but when you also increase your velocity, you have more momentum, so it's harder to stop.
Yeah, okay. And it takes more energy to go from 0 to 15 than 15 to 30, right? This is why, what he rattled off is why I went to law school and was a history major, not a science major. Very good, he did that well. But it's the law of momentum. Going from 0 to 15 takes, what, 3 or 4 times the energy from going from 15 to 30? So the idea in the roundabout, most of the time you don't have to stop like you do at the traffic light. Half the cars at least are stopped half the time, probably higher than that with the turn lanes. The roundabout, you just slow down, you don't come to a complete stop. Our city engineer took that formula, figured out we're saving 30,000 tons of carbon a year with our 126 roundabouts this year. That's a lot of carbon. And it's a lot of fuel savings for the people that live and drive in Carmel. You angle them. Now, roundabouts are different than the big rotaries you see in the Northeast, or the Monument Circle in Indianapolis would be a rotary. Those, because they're bigger, it's counterintuitive. The bigger they get, the more dangerous they get because speeds get higher. You're not angled when you go into it, so you get T-bones instead of side swipes. So, as architects and land planners, you'll have some fights with civil engineers over the, Purdue actually has me come and speak occasionally, and I give the engineers a hard time about, you gotta think outside the box, and just because you've done it this way forever doesn't mean it's the best way. Didn't have any engineering training, so I could challenge these guys and say, why are we doing it this way? It doesn't work very well. Then we did roundabout interchanges too. That was Keystone Avenue before we fixed it. That was 106th Street, which we did in the summer of 2007, so 12 years ago. But you couldn't cross that street. Think about crossing that street as a pedestrian. Nobody did that. It was like the Great Wall of China. Now you can walk around. All you have to do, you see that little red pedestrian path at the side? All you have to do is cross the exit or the entrance lane, look in one direction, walk through the middle, look in the other direction. Much, much safer. First day that was built, I drove over it, saw some guy walking across, reading a book, walking across Keystone Avenue. And we saved 43 houses. If you'd done a tight diamond interchange, which is what the engineers will promote a lot of times, you have to start drawing those stoplights farther and farther out because of the queuing distance between the two lights, the line between the two lights. Here, because of the constant flow at the roundabouts, you don't need that much real estate to do it. We believe putting public sculpture in our roundabouts. That's sculpture called Beacon Bloom, LED lights, done by a man named Arlen Baylis, who teaches at Anderson College. Came from Wales originally. He just installed a new one this week in Carmel as well, which is 3 big roses. But we see the roundabouts as a great place to put beautiful public sculpture as well. We're working with the lighting lab. IDEA is the official name here in your college. Come up with some ideas for a 911 tower and a water tower right in our, did I get that right, IDEA? IDEA, is that how you say it? IDEA, okay. And working to try to come up with some neat lighting solutions to what otherwise would be considered something that would be ugly. But making it a beautiful place. This is where people live. And think about poor people. All of you are going to be college grads. You're going to have the ability to travel to some of those most beautiful places on earth as you get out in the world, save your money and travel. But what about the people who don't go to college? About the people who don't have money, who don't have college degree salaries? Why shouldn't their city be a beautiful place too for the people that can't afford to travel and see places? So that's what we're trying to do in Carmel. We have this great opportunity to build a brand new city. Going back, okay, the internet changed our suburbs forever. So we have this ability to build this brand new city. How do we do it? And that's why I get up every morning and love to go to work, because you get to work on these things. And when you get out, and maybe even while you're still a student, you'll get the opportunity to work with firms that help people like me do this. So anyway, let's open up for some questions. Criticism. Your parents living in Carmel didn't get their trash picked up this week. I'll take care of that, whatever. Yes, sir.
Yes, it seems that Fishers, Indiana has attempted to emulate a lot of your success with their establishment of mixed-use districts along the Nickel Plate corridor. Why do you think it is that Fishers has not emulated your success with roundabouts?
They've built 30. We have 126. I think it's a funding issue for Fishers. I think they'd like to build more. Yes?
How can anyone run against this?
Oh, let me tell you, I just went through a campaign. Too much money, too much debt. Of course, we're a growing city, so you have some debt associated with these things. We watch the percentage of debt. Don't let it get over 20% of our revenues. But if I give somebody an hour, I can usually show them why the debt makes sense. It's hard to do that with 100,000 people. I think people generally like what we're doing. It's hard to get elected after 6 terms in office. You have to tell people no from time to time. And so the elections get increasingly difficult, but we won by 12% in the Republican primary in May. Usually it's 20, so it's a little lower than usual. And the Democratic Party chose not to run anybody against me, so I'm thankful for that. Yes?
You look at San Francisco and Seattle.
Yes.
The disparity between what you said, the people that can't travel the world, the laborers and the people that are working, and the high-tech companies that come in making 6 figures easily.
My oldest son lives in the Bay Area right now, and he paid 5.5 times for a house what he would have paid in Carmel, Indiana, and Carmel's high for Indiana.
How do you think about that and not letting that happen?
Good question. We've been, and that actually came up in our campaign. It was one of the few good things we talked about in the campaigns that generated some ideas. We started to think about it more. I told folks at lunch, I'll tell you, I haven't formally announced this yet, so you're really hearing it first, unless you were at lunch today, you're hearing it first here. We're going back to an old concept. It's called accessory unit dwellings. Sometimes people refer to them as granny flats. So it might be an apartment above a garage. It might be an apartment adjacent to the garage in the backyard off the alley. But what it does, it mixes up low-income people with people living in more expensive houses. I remember when I was a kid, I grew up outside of Goshen, Indiana, a little town about 10 miles north. Anybody here from that, Elkhart County? You know what I'm talking about? And my dad had grown up 220 South 7th Street, the very traditional part. The house had been built in 1910. He was born in 1928. My grandparents still lived there in the 50s and 60s and early 70s that I remember. My great-grandmother lived across the street. And after her husband had died, who I never knew, I knew her, she had died before, when I was just a little tiny baby, I didn't remember him. She sold her big house, but kept what's called a life estate, right to stay in the accessory dwelling unit next to the garage behind it. So she's across the street from her daughter, could walk to the corner market, could walk 2 blocks to Main Street and shop, didn't own a car. A lot of people didn't still in 1960, especially older people. But that worked. Here she was on a limited Social Security income. Her husband had died, sold a big house, saved the money, but lived in that unit. So we're thinking about doing something nobody else, we don't think, has done in the United States recently, and that is making a percentage of any new development have at least 10% accessory dwelling units. If they want their zoning to do accessory, they have to put 10% in. Now the homeowner that buys that house can choose to lease it out, use it, not use it, put a weight room out there if they want to, whatever they want to. You know, a place for the spouses to get away if they're not getting along, whatever. But, you know, but some of them will get leased. And I think eventually it'll start to help that affordability question. But we're dealing with that right now in Carmel because we got older neighborhoods that were kind of in rundown areas 20 years ago. Now the houses back then were selling for $50,000, $60,000, $70,000. Today, the lot with the house torn down is worth $350,000. And so that is becoming an issue for us. How does the average guy or the average family afford that house? Any other questions? Yes, sir.
20 years ago, Carmel didn't have the same vision as you do. It had one-story zoning limits in
We took it incrementally. I used what's called an overlay zone in the beginning, and just did small areas because you wouldn't get citywide opposite. You might get a few people in that area who were skeptical about it, didn't understand it, but I didn't take it on all at once. I did it incrementally, did some projects to show how nice it could be, and then it got easier and easier. Since then, we have, it started out, we call it CC1, which just stood for City Center District, which is our big project. But now we've just abbreviated it C. We have C1, 2, and 3 zoning. But basically, in all those areas, it requires a minimum height and a maximum height. It requires mixed use, doesn't allow it, but requires it on a percentage of the floor plate. So we moved a long way. It's what's called, your teachers will be familiar with this, but it's called form-based zoning. And we have a mix still in Carmel. You know, doing it in a subdivision probably doesn't make sense today if it's a new subdivision. But if somebody comes and wants to develop the corner, we certainly look at variances and how do we fit something in that may serve that neighborhood appropriately. But yeah, we're moving to a form-based.
Isn't that right? You bought that.
Initially we bought the ground to do it, but today we don't do as much of that. We still do on key pieces. But a lot of it, though, we don't buy it, we've just rezoned it. Or we'll, if it's outside the center area of the zone as one of the C zones, level zonings, which is basically form-based code, we help the applicant do a variance, go through a variance process. In the comprehensive plan's a guide when we start that process too. You know, that's just a plan, that's not zoning, that's not the law, it's just a suggestion. But we go back to the comprehensive plan, land use plan as well. So it's a mismatch, and I think as you try to change what's been done for 70 years, you got to go at it a bit incrementally. A few cities have managed to do it. Birmingham, Michigan did it citywide. I'm amazed that they got that through, quite honestly. Andres Dwani was involved in that one, and he can be persuasive. You know, he and Jeff Spack and his wife, Elizabeth Plater-Zerberg, wrote the book, Suburban Nation. The title says it all, Suburban Nation, Rise of Sprawl, Decline of the American Dream. Read that book. If your teachers haven't assigned it when you have some extra time, right, as a student, but that's worth reading. It's an easy read. Go read Suburban Nation. And then after you read that one, email me, I'll give you 4 or 5 others, but I'm imagining you've got a great faculty here that they've assigned most of these things to you. in your classes as well. Any other questions? Criticisms? This is an academic institution. It's okay to criticize. We need to kick ideas around. Yes, ma'am.
So many cities in the Midwest plan for depopulation. What are some of the biggest challenges of the rapid population growth that you've seen?
Our biggest challenge right now is workforce. We have so many employers that can't get the employees they need. We are growing. One of the problems that I see in the horizon is people don't want a 5,000 square foot house on an acre. And we have this huge amount of sprawling, beautiful subdivisions that are aging, 30, 40 years old at this point, and those prices are not going up. The prices, you know, I see people every day, they're selling their $600,000, $700,000 house out on the edge of Carmel on half an acre, you know, beautiful homes, but on big lots, can't walk anywhere they need to go, selling them, trying to buy a much smaller house in our center core so they can walk to restaurants, they walk to the dry cleaners, they can walk to the library, the schools, our concert hall and theaters, the Monon Trail, all these things. And so that's going to be a problem. Our housing stock is not appropriate. You know, a lot of suburbs for many years said, if you want to live here, you have to live in a subdivision. We're not going to allow apartments. We're not going to allow, and besides all the racial and economic overtones and people that can afford big houses, even that set aside, here is government telling people, if you want to live here, this is how you have to live. You have no options. We don't want apartments, we don't want townhomes, we don't want condos. And so it's so important as a community, when you plan a community, to make certain that you have options for people. I remember one day I ran into a guy was walking my dog, my neighborhood, and it was a moderately priced neighborhood, but you know, half-acre lawns, and he was out staring at his lawnmower. Now, everybody in this room from the Midwest has operated a lawnmower, right? Anybody that hasn't? This guy was looking at it like it was from Mars. So I said to him, I said, ever used one of those things before? And I called it right because he answered me in one of the strongest Bronx accents I'd ever heard. And he said, no, I grew up in New York City. We didn't have yards. I had a 4-foot space. We planted some flowers in, about like this, he said. He said, I don't know how to turn this thing on. I said, you put oil in it? He said, it takes oil. And so I showed him how to put oil and gas in it. We kind of got to be friends. I'd see him every day when I walked the dog. And he had little kids at the time, put up a swing set in the back. He said, you know, I'm never moving back to New York. I love the Midwest. I love Carmel. Then one day I saw his house go up for sale. And I said, you're not going back to New York? He said, oh no, never going back to New York. He said, you know what I'm doing though? I'm going back and buying one of those townhomes in downtown Carmel because that's what I grew up in, and that's what I really want as I get older. My kids don't use that swing set anymore, and I'm tired of mowing the lawn. And think about that. Think about people coming from China or Europe where they don't have lawns. They just have big apartment and condo buildings. They don't know how to use that lawnmower. They don't want to clean gutters. It's not for everybody. So having a variety of housing stock, I think, is really important if a city wants to be competitive. If you want to be competitive for a diverse global workforce, you got to have options for people. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for having me. This has been fun. I hope that it was helpful to you.